Next, please welcome to the stage the Managing Director of the German Marshall Fund's Indo-Pacific Program, Bonnie Glaser, Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment, and Director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, Dr. Joanna Lewis, and the Managing Director of Eurasia Group's China practice, Rick Waters, for a conversation with FP's Amelia Lester on charting a new course for U.S.-China relations.
Hello again. I'm really glad that we have this panel now because I think everyone probably agrees with me that that made for some grim listening. So this is called The Path Forward, Charting a New Course for U.S.-China Relations. And I want to focus it on the idea of how we can better manage this relationship, how we can avoid the scenarios that we heard about in the previous panel. And the key question I'm going to be coming back to is what is realistic and what is attainable for both the US and China. So let's start with you, Rick, and the US-China bilateral relationship. You were in the State Department for 27 years. This summer you left, you're now at Eurasia Group, and this is a really crucial moment in US-China relations. Biden and Xi are about to meet in San Francisco. I want to know from you, what do you think the US government is thinking right now? There's kind of been this lurching back and forth of late after 3 to 4 years of what seemed like an escalatory spiral. That now seems to have been reined in a little bit in recent months, but what's the through line in that relationship?
Sure. Well, good to see you all. Good to be here, and we'll try to be more uplifting than the last panel. Although it's good to hear Zach and Lyle. I think when you look back at the China relationship under the Biden-Harris administration, and again, I don't speak for them anymore, but I think what we've seen is that the shift to a paradigm of strategic competition in many domains was always going to entail a lot of pressure in the relationship. And I think where there is some convergence, both in Beijing and in Washington, is with a shared desire to make sure that where this competition is occurring, it is happening deliberately. It isn't happening unintentionally. And I think, a year ago in August with the events surrounding the Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, I think that had a little bit of a catalytic effect going into the last summit the leaders had, where they realized that you need to have channels at a senior level that are empowered so you can at least understand the other side's intentions. Because the worst scenario is one in which the other side is simply inventing a caricature of what the other intends. So I have pretty modest expectations for the meeting in San Francisco. I think really at this point, U.S.-China symmetry is no longer about the major lists of deliverables, the building the relationship. I think it's more now about managing a relationship that's in a secular decline, but ensuring that process of managing a relationship that's increasingly characterized by competition is one that doesn't veer into conflict or spill out of control.
And maybe the spy balloon incident really highlighted that there does need to be more intentional communication, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if you look back at the Bali summit last year, the leaders agreed on basically two things. One was to reopen senior level channels that were empowered, not big dialogue structures, but people who in the domains they worked on were empowered to speak about their policies clearly with the other. The only other agreement was to set a floor. But I think there was really not much definition to that concept. And then you're right, Bali was a year ago November, the last in-person meeting, and it took 7 months to actually really begin the process of implementing what they had talked about because of the balloon, because of the politics surrounding it, and because of the challenges politically that both sides have when a disruptive variable prevents them from managing that decline in the relationship.
Bonnie, there have been some seemingly successful trips since then. I'm thinking of California Governor Gavin Newsom's trip, US Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's trip, and then the top Chinese diplomat Wang Yi came to Washington. I think people thought that was fairly successful. But It strikes me that that sits oddly with the rhetoric coming from China. We heard this in the previous panel, and officials in state media still do sound pretty virulently anti-Western. So what do you think we can realistically expect from this meeting next week? Do you share Rick's fairly modest aspirations for it?
I do share Rick's very modest expectations. China will continue to want to compete on the global stage, especially to continue to get support from the global South, to portray itself as having better intentions than the United States, whether it be in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world. I think that the Chinese believe they have a better form of governance, and they have been pushing that for some time. So just because we are having a summit does not mean that they are going to set aside those other ambitions that they have on the global stage. And they are seeking to undermine the support for the United States and I think sort of damage U.S. reputation. That said, there is, as Rick said, interest on both sides in managing the relationship, in preventing it from spiraling out of control. I think both sides, for their own reasons, which are different, have a particular interest at this time in getting this stabilization process to stick. China is facing headwinds in their economy. There are other difficulties at home that I think that Xi Jinping is focused on. We, of course, are going into a presidential election year. We will not have a summit next year between U.S. and Chinese leaders, and probably some dialogues will continue, but we will not be focused on the relationship in the way that we are today. So I think there will be some, and I will say outcomes. The word deliverables probably will not be used. But it does look like the Chinese are signaling a willingness to resume the mill channels that were suspended when Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan. And I think that's very important, particularly the operational safety dialogue that we have. And then we'll hear Joanna tell us whether there will be any progress on climate. And I think President Biden is quite keen to make some progress on resuming law enforcement with China, particularly in the counter-narcotics area. And this, of course, pertains to fentanyl. So this is very important to the United States. So I think those are some of the things that we may see come out of this meeting.
Thank you for that list of specifics. That's nice to hear. Joanna, you've been working on clean energy policy for 2 decades with a focus on China. And I'm just going to read out the title of your new book, Cooperating for the Climate, Learning from International Partnerships in China's Clean Energy Sector. That sounds great. I want to ask you about how we can potentially look to cooperation on climate for common ground in what are clearly fraught times. You helped build the roadmap for US-China climate cooperation in the Obama era too. You write in your book that the United States and the Soviet Union were able to overcome their differences during the Cold War to eradicate smallpox, and that the United States and China should follow suit to preserve a livable planet, which I think we can all agree is an important goal. So what does each country need to start doing differently to make that happen?
Well, when it comes to climate change, I mean, we really can't address this issue without both the United States and China taking action. We're the largest emitters in the world, and the rest of the world really looks closely at the U.S.-China bilateral relationship when it comes to climate change. In the months leading up to the Paris Agreement, it was really the U.S.-China bilateral relationship and the fact that both countries were able to come forward with their pledges that mobilized global action. And so, we see examples of that happening in the climate space. We've been cooperating with China for decades on clean energy and climate change. It has sort of been one of the more constructive, I think, aspects of the relationship. But
it's been happening less, right?
It's been happening less, and this is really because, the cornerstone of a lot of our climate cooperation, as the book talks about, was really on clean energy technology, accelerating innovation, accelerating deployment. And of course, over the past 2 decades, China has risen to become the leading manufacturer and deployer of most of the key clean energy technologies that the world needs for the low carbon transition: wind, solar, and now batteries for electric vehicles. So this, of course, has created this competitive environment where the United States, through the Inflation Reduction Act and other legislation, is now trying to rebuild our own clean energy industries, to build our own innovation capacity, which is, of course, important. But the clean energy supply chains are so reliant on China right now. We need to think of a way to do this that avoids real economic and security risks to the United States, but doesn't slow the low carbon transition.
And how do you think the Biden administration is doing on that?
Well, I think this is a really challenging, policy investigation because, really, like, we're in a situation now where, for example, we want to push battery manufacturing in the United States. And we are, there's been, for example, a partnership between Ford and CATL, the largest battery manufacturer in the world, a Chinese company for electric vehicles. A lot of scrutiny over this partnership, even though this would be a licensing, essentially, of advanced technology to a U.S. company, because we are behind. This is an area where the Chinese government has invested strategically through science and technology planning over the last few decades, and they were able to leapfrog in a lot of these areas. It's sort of, we're back to, it used to be we were transferring technology to China. We're really in a new world. And I think it's sort of naive to think that we can just go it alone. China is so central to this, it's actually going to benefit us if we can figure out a way to engage strategically so that we avoid, the serious risks surrounding intellectual property and other areas. But we know how to manage this, and I think, no cooperation, particularly in the science and technology front, is ultimately detrimental to the U.S. and to the global innovation system.
There is consensus, though, that trade barriers between the United States and China are going to throw a wrench in the innovation process because they stifle competition. And Rick, you're out of government now, so I'm going to just ask you to be as candid as you can be here. Given the protectionism that is gripping both countries, what do you think remains possible in this space?
In the broader economic trade space?
In the climate cooperation space specifically?
Well, I think in addition to the points that Joanna's made, I think the challenge is in some ways the politics. I think it's difficult now for the US or China to be seen as doing something for the other. And so I think the most that's likely in the transnational areas, climate, health, food security, where the US and China have overlapping, if not identical interests, is perhaps coordination of parallel policies. That might be the most you can expect. And so I think we just have to acknowledge that in the often zero-sum politics, both in Beijing and Washington, the expectations have to be more modest than in the era of grand US-China deals that then drove the global conversation.
Bonnie, let's talk about a particular threat that was talked about in the last panel, which is a Chinese attack on Taiwan. She did instruct the PLA to be ready by 2027 for potential forceful unification. The memo that caused such a stir in Washington by the head of US Air Mobility Command, Mike Minahan, that predicted war by 2025, that was talked about in the last panel, is not an especially well-informed memo, but has nonetheless, I think, it's safe to say, dominated conversation in Washington since its release. What strikes me a lot of the time in this is that we seem to talk about war as though neither side has any agency in it happening in these predictions. And so I instead kind of want to reframe it a bit and ask you how strong US support for Taiwan's security shapes this scenario, and what measures do you think the US can take to reduce the risk of a military confrontation?
Those are very good questions. I've never seen more discussion about Taiwan globally in my life. This is an issue I've been working on for many decades. There's a lot of, I think, wrong information. And I've published a great deal. I had an article in the New York Times last Sunday and an article that came out in War of the Rocks today, and co-authored a book that came out earlier this year. So my views are fairly well known. I think the administration is right to say that a conflict is neither imminent nor inevitable. And the United States has done, I think, under the Biden administration, some things that are right. And then I'll talk about a few things that I think are wrong. The things that are right are to recognize that there is a risk. Xi Jinping could miscalculate. He could be getting bad information. He could perceive that this is something that he could achieve, that he could take over Taiwan at an acceptable cost. And so I think that what we see coming out of the Biden administration is an effort to very clearly convey to Xi Jinping, and not just us, but really internationalizing this issue. China doesn't like that, but we are talking with every one of our allies and partners and asking them what they can do to strengthen deterrence. And there's various things that countries are doing. Some are sailing through the Taiwan Strait with us. Some are increasing their contacts or signing trade agreements with Taiwan. So there's a lot that countries can do. It isn't just in the military area that matters. And then, of course, and the prior panel talked about this, helping Taiwan's capabilities and also developing our own capabilities, having a more distributed and resilient and survivable force posture in the region. Because if we're not actually capable of defending Taiwan, then the risk of war grows. But the other side of deterrence, and let's be clear that deterrence is composed of both credible threats and credible assurances. And when you're investing in strengthening those credible threats, there is even more need to strengthen your credible assurances. So China essentially, I think, needs to have confidence that if Taiwan is not declaring independence, if we are not supporting it, that there is no need for them, to strike Taiwan. They have to understand we are not going to restore our mutual defense treaty with Taiwan, which we abrogated as a condition of normalization. So essentially, if the Chinese say, right, we will not use force, that there will not be an outcome of permanent separation. And I think that's the reassurance that we need to provide. And we see a lot of confusing signals coming from this administration. There was 2 instances in which President Biden said that Taiwan is independent and should be allowed to make its own choices. That's problematic because it actually it contravenes our policy and it undermines assurances. So I think all 3 sides need to give assurances. I don't believe that it's just the United States. It is also the PRC and Taiwan. And as we have an election coming up in Taiwan in January, then it is incumbent on anybody who is elected to pursue a set of policies that will not increase tensions in the Taiwan Strait. But we have to do more to ensure that we have credible threats as well. So doing the assurances side and not enhancing our ability to defend Taiwan and ensuring that Xi Jinping is clear that there is the possibility we would intervene, that's important too. So both credible threats and credible assurances need to be bolstered.
It almost sounds as though you feel that the strategic ambiguity has gotten too ambiguous. There needs to be a little bit more clarity on the US side.
Well, I've written extensively that I don't support strategic clarity, again, because the Chinese already know that the United States is likely to intervene in the Taiwan Strait crisis. The PLA has assumed that in their own calculus for a very long time. But providing Taiwan with strategic clarity, essentially saying we give them an ironclad commitment to defend them, essentially, as I said, we could be misinterpreted by Beijing as restoring this mutual defense. We had a defense commitment for Taiwan for 1954 to 1979. And so I don't think we need to say what we will do, how we will intervene, whether we would intervene. The Chinese know that it's, especially the last 3 years, it is exceedingly likely that we would intervene. But I think strategic clarity is simply unnecessary and could provoke the attack that we're seeking to deter.
Rick, you oversaw the creation of the Office of China Coordination, informally known as China House, which is a kind of central desk for China watchers at the State Department. What do you say to critics, and I can name a couple here, Susan Thornton, who is the former top acting State Department envoy for East Asia from 2017 to 2018, who called the program a bad idea. She said it gives rise to the kind of hype and distortions that we see now around Chinese activities. Has the State Department and the US government generally overinflated the threat that China poses, either to Taiwan or to the US directly?
I think to understand what Secretary Blinken and his predecessor, Secretary Pompeo, wanted to achieve with China House, it gets back to the fact that the US-China relationship went from being a primarily bilateral relationship, a much more traditional relationship, where you sought on a transactional basis to achieve your goals, bearing in mind the interests of the other, to a very different type of relationship, one in which it is now primarily competitive. And the central premise of the administration's China strategy is essentially to shape China's policy environment around it through strengthening allies and partner relationships on an ad hoc basis, often specific to given issues. So to get back to the organizational question, I think it was only natural that the executive branch, the national security branch, not just state, start to reimagine how do you prosecute a global, multidimensional challenge? Because the picture that I saw when I headed the China desk a few years before this project started was a bureaucracy that was not configured to deal with technology competition, to deal with competition at a subnational level. That simply isn't what the State Department bilateral desks were configured to do. So I give a lot of credit, frankly, to both administrations because Secretary Pompeo got the positions and Secretary Blinken continued to lead the project and bring it to fruition. And the fact that there was actually bipartisan support for this reimagining and that it's actually started to happen in other parts of the national security bureaucracy, I think is just a testament to the fact that we're at an inflection point. And it was necessary. It was always going to be a little bit painful. Don't do a reorg at the State Department without knowing what you're getting into. But I think it was the right thing to do, and I'm very proud of the team that persevered through it because I think we'll look back and we'll recognize that our country is better off with more sophisticated policy development mechanisms for a challenge of this magnitude.
Okay, I promised us some forward-thinking ideas here. So in the last few minutes, that's what I'm gonna focus on. Joanna, let's come to you, and I wondered if you could explore one specific idea that you propose in your book to enhance cooperation on climate between the US and China, and that is to revive the US-China Clean Energy Research Center or something akin to it. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. So one of the cornerstones or bilateral initiatives of the Obama administration with China was something called the US-China Clean Energy Research Center. This is the largest sort of bilateral initiative we've ever done with China in the science and technology area. It involved hundreds of scientists from both countries cooperating on a variety of clean energy technologies. Our national labs were involved, many of our companies. It was a public-private partnership. And what was unique about it was that, first of all, we weren't sort of providing any direct funding support to China. It was self-funded by both sides. It was, purely a sort of 50-50 split where both sides brought expertise and resources to the table. And the other thing that made it unique was that, intellectual property, of course, is always an issue when you do this sort of cross-border, cross-national research and development that involves, information coming in from both sides. And the partnership really faced this head on and set up a special arrangement for how IP would be protected in the context of this partnership. And that was reflected, there's language in the renewed 2018 US-China Science and Technology Agreement. This is something that both presidents signed off on. So it was really the first time that we'd sort of escalated the idea of protecting intellectual property in a joint R&D partnership this way. And it worked quite well. Now we look back on this and think, this is not the political climate to be doing science and technology cooperation with China of that scale. And while there's some truth to that, I do think that Doing nothing is also not the answer. Again, we are in what scientists call the pivotal decade for addressing climate change. If we don't deploy massive amounts of low carbon technologies before 2030, we avoid the ability to get on the emissions trajectories that we need to, avoid really dangerous impacts. We're already seeing, of course, climate impacts around the world. China's facing them, we're facing them. So, I do think that there are ways to re-envision the relationship. As Rick said, I think looking at these sort of parallel policy processes is quite productive. Methane has been a big focus, for example, of the current administration in its engagement with China. There was a meeting last week in advance of the APEC summit between our special envoy, John Kerry, and the Chinese counterpart, Xie Jinhua, where by all reports, it was constructive and is sort of teeing up some re-engagement on climate. And hours after that meeting, China released its sort of long-awaited national methane plan, which is the first time China's released any policy strategy related to a very potent greenhouse gas that is key to the solution. So, I think there's ways to re-envision how we engage that takes into account the current political climate.
Some green shoots there. Thank you. Bonnie, again, looking forward as we wrap up this morning, I'm curious about how China's economic prospects, which you referenced at the beginning, the headwinds it's facing, how they affect the relationship going forward. Does it make it more or less likely that the US relationship gets worse if China does slip from motion to stagnation, as we've been talking about? And does it make China more or less dangerous to be in economic troubles?
Well, you're not asking me for green shoots.
No, I figured that was
okay.
Too hard. Unless you've got some.
I do, but I don't want to dominate the last 4 minutes. But I do think the dialogue between our two militaries on operational safety is particularly important, and I do hope that will resume. But your question is a very difficult one.
You have 3 minutes.
3 minutes. We have to give Rick some time, too. I really think that it would be presumptuous to assume, as some people have, first that we have a peaking economy in China. Peaking sort of suggests that you have the economy go up and then go down. We're likely to see a plateau. I'm not an economist, but I think that is the most likely outcome where China continues to grow at just a slower rate. And because there are very specific problems that require Xi Jinping's attention, my guess is that there will be continued focus on doing so and less adventurism abroad. Not everybody agrees with that. There are people who think that the Chinese would try to distract from domestic difficulties by potentially invading Taiwan. Well, that would be incredibly risky because a failed invasion at a time of real economic troubles, I think ultimately leads to a major threat to legitimacy of the party and to the position of Xi Jinping. So I don't think it makes an attack on Taiwan more likely. But China will continue to take the actions that are necessary to protect its own sovereignty and its core interests. And we're never quite clear how broadly defined, core interest is. But it's certainly Taiwan, it is Xinjiang and Tibet, and it's probably the South China Sea, and it could be other disputed borders. So we should not underestimate if they feel threatened, their willingness to do that. But I think that China's economic headwinds make them particularly, I think, vulnerable at this time because of the US and, of course, our allies imposing restrictions on technology. This is something, my sense from what we're hearing from senior Chinese officials, is the single most important issue for them other than Taiwan. And I doubt that the Biden administration is going to slow down its efforts on this front. And this will be very challenging for China going forward, I think.
Rick, last question of the morning to you. I want to bring it back again to next week's meeting between Biden and Xi. These personal relationships can make a difference. We saw that when Australia had a change of government last year, it prompted a reset in the China-Australia relationship, and China backed down from its bans on Australian coal and other imports. And then when Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese visited Beijing recently, everyone seemed to be all smiles. I know we started today by you saying you have modest ambitions for that meeting, but I wondered if you could end by telling us a little bit of your reflections on how much those personal relationships and personal diplomacy can dial down the temperature at a time like this.
Well, I think they're critical, especially given the evolution of the Chinese system. Much of what we've talked about today, whether it's in the transnational space or on the issues in which the two sides are trying to manage their differences, it requires permission from the Chinese leadership to even discuss those issues with the U.S. Biden and Xi have a long history. They've known each other for probably better than any other two leaders in the U.S.-China context since the recognition period, and so it does matter. It does matter, but I don't think that we want to draw from that the conclusion that this meeting in San Francisco will be a fundamental inflection point. I think at this point, the policy lines on both sides are set, and the conditions going into the final year of a first term are really more about implementing what they intended to implement last year at Bali, with perhaps some modest outcomes, but not major deliverables, and putting themselves on a footing next year to manage competition within the bounds that they're attempting to set.
Well, I'm sure we'll be all watching it very closely, but now it's time to end this panel. Bonnie Glaser, Dr. Joanna Lewis, and Rick Waters, thank you so much for being here today.